It was noon on a grey November day in 1902 when Captain James McMath looked out across the water and saw her, a steel-hulled freighter called the Bannockburn, cutting steady through the whitecaps of Lake Superior, exactly where she should have been. He noted her position. He watched her sail on toward the horizon. And then, in the space of a few minutes, with no fog, no explosion, no distress signal, she was gone. Not sunk in the way a ship usually sinks. Not broken apart with debris scattered for searchers to find. Simply gone, as if the lake itself had reached up and swallowed her whole. 20 men vanished with her. To this day, more than a century later, not one body, not one plank of her hull, has ever been recovered. And in the decades since, sailors crossing that same stretch of water have sworn, again and again, that they've seen her still out there, sailing on, forever trying to finish a voyage that ended before it should have. This is not an isolated story. This is the Great Lakes. 5 inland seas stretching across the heart of North America, so vast that sailors who cross them stop calling them lakes at all and start calling them what they really are, oceans without salt, oceans that can kill you just as fast. Beneath their surface lie more than 6,000 shipwrecks and the remains of somewhere close to 30,000 sailors who never made it home. And scattered among those 6,000 wrecks are a small, strange handful of ships that refuse, according to the people who live and work on these waters, to stay sunk. Ships spotted decades after they went down. Ships that appear out of the fog, sail for a few impossible minutes, and disappear again. Ships that have earned a name sailors don't use lightly, ghost ships. Over the next several minutes, we're going to trace the stories of the most famous phantom vessels ever reported on the Great Lakes, from the very first ship ever lost on these waters, more than 3 centuries ago, to a modern tragedy still remembered in song. We'll look at what actually happened to these ships, what the historical record can tell us, and what it can't. And we'll ask the question that has haunted sailors on these lakes since the earliest days of American exploration: when a ship vanishes without a trace, where does it actually go? To understand why the Great Lakes produce so many of these stories, you first have to understand just how deadly they really are. Lake Superior alone reaches depths of well over 1,000 feet in places, with water so cold that a body, once it goes under, may never resurface. The cold slows decomposition so dramatically that the gases which normally bring a corpse back to the surface simply never build up. Fishermen and sailors on Superior have a grim old saying: the lake never gives up her dead. That's not poetry. It's a documented fact of the region's maritime history, and it's one of the reasons so many Great Lakes wrecks were never found for decades, sometimes never at all. Add to that the sudden, violent storms these lakes are famous for, squalls that can turn calm water into 30-foot waves in under an hour, with almost no warning, and you start to understand why this region became, and remains, one of the most treacherous stretches of navigable water in North America. Ships have been vanishing here since Europeans first put wooden hulls on the water. And the very first one to disappear set the tone for everything that followed. Her name was Griffon, and her story begins not with a storm, but with ambition. In the winter of 1679, a French explorer named René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, began construction on a small bark in the wilderness near the Niagara River, in what is now New York State. La Salle was a man obsessed with the idea of building a trade empire across the interior of North America, and Le Griffon was meant to be the vessel that made it possible, the first full-sized sailing ship ever to venture onto the upper Great Lakes. By August of that year, she was ready. Armed with cannons, roughly 45 feet long, she launched to great ceremony and sailed west, crossing Lake Erie, threading through Lake Huron, and finally reaching the waters near Green Bay on Lake Michigan, where La Salle intended to load her with furs to pay off the creditors who had bankrolled his expedition. What happened next has been debated for 340 years. On September 18, 1679, La Salle sent Le Griffon back east, loaded with furs and captained by a pilot the crew apparently didn't trust, a man La Salle himself would later suspect of deliberately wrecking the ship. 6 men were aboard. A single cannon shot rang out as she set sail, a farewell signal to those watching from shore. Witnesses on land said they couldn't tell which direction she went. And then, nothing. No wreckage. No bodies. No survivors to tell the tale. A massive 4-day storm swept the region the very next day, and for centuries, that storm has been the leading explanation, but it has never been more than an explanation. Some historians believe local tribes attacked the ship. LaSalle himself came to suspect mutiny, that his own pilot had stolen the furs and scuttled the vessel to sell the cargo elsewhere. Nobody knows. What we do know is this: Le Griffon became the first ship ever lost on the Great Lakes, and in the centuries since, treasure hunters and marine archaeologists have searched obsessively for her wreck. Dozens of discoveries have been announced. Every single one, when examined by state and federal archaeologists, has turned out to be something else: a modern piling, a natural rock formation, another wreck entirely. As recently as the 2010s, a team of divers claimed to have found timber they believed belonged to Le Griffon lodged in the lakebed near northern Lake Michigan, a claim that triggered international legal disputes between the discoverers, the state of Michigan, and the government of France. The case remains unresolved. Le Griffon, in other words, is still missing. And if the first ship ever lost on the Great Lakes could vanish so completely that we still can't find her after 3.5 centuries of searching, what chance did anyone have of explaining what happened, 200 years later, to a modern steel freighter that disappeared in broad daylight? That brings us back to the Bannockburn, the ship we opened with, the one that would come to be known across the Great Lakes as the Flying Dutchman, after the legendary cursed ghost ship of ocean-going folklore. On November 20, 1902, the Bannockburn set out from Fort William, on the Canadian shore of Lake Superior, loaded with grain and bound for the town of Midland. Her crew of 20 was young, most of the men were between 17 and 20 years old, with the oldest crew member only 37, a common arrangement at the time, since young sailors were cheap to hire and shipping companies had every financial incentive to keep costs down. The ship's captain, George Wood, and her chief engineer, George Booth, were experienced men from Ontario, and by all accounts the Bannockburn was a solid, reliable steel-hulled freighter, even though she had technically sunk once before, back in 1897, after striking a lock wall in the Welland Canal. She'd been salvaged and repaired without much drama. Nobody expected 1902 to be any different. But that November, one of the worst snowstorms of the year rolled across Lake Superior. On the afternoon of the 21st, Captain McMath of the passing steamer Algonquin spotted the Bannockburn making steady progress through the rough water, and logged her position, as was standard practice. Minutes later, when he looked again, she was gone. Not struggling. Not listing. Not sending up flares. Simply absent from the horizon where she had been moments before. When the Bannockburn failed to arrive at Midland, the Montreal Transportation Company reported her missing, and by the end of November, she'd been officially given up for lost. Search parties combed the lake for weeks. They found almost nothing, an oar, a single life preserver, and that was all. No bodies were ever recovered, which experts at the time attributed to the extraordinary depth of Lake Superior at that stretch of water, sometimes exceeding 1,300 feet. Within a year, sailors were already calling her a ghost ship. The nickname, Flying Dutchman, seems to have been popularized by an early Great Lakes historian named Oliver Cowood, who, according to modern marine archaeologists studying the case, was, first and foremost, a storyteller looking to draw the same romance and dread associated with ocean shipwrecks into stories about America's inland seas. But the sightings that followed weren't confined to old sailors' tall tales told over a drink. For more than 100 years, mariners navigating that same stretch of Lake Superior have reported seeing a ship matching the Bannockburn's unmistakable profile emerging from the mist, sailing for a few moments, and then dissolving back into the fog as though she had never been there at all. Some reports, admittedly, sound like campfire exaggeration, sailors claiming to see skeletal figures standing at her portholes. But other sightings have come from far more sober sources, working captains and crew members, people with professional reputations to protect and nothing obvious to gain by inventing stories. As recently as 2016, a video captured by a boater named Jason Asselin on Lake Superior appeared to show an old-style freighter moving through fog in a location where no such vessel should have been, footage that spread quickly among Great Lakes shipping communities, with many pointing to it as the latest sighting of the Bannockburn. Skeptics point to atmospheric distortion. Believers point to more than a century of consistent testimony. Either way, more than 120 years after she disappeared in front of a witness in broad daylight, the Bannockburn has never been found. Her wreck lies somewhere in one of the coldest, deepest stretches of fresh water on the planet, and by the lake's own grim reputation, she may stay there forever, undiscovered, which is perhaps exactly why the stories about her refuse to die. If the Bannockburn is the Great Lakes' most famous ghost ship, there's another whose story cuts even deeper, because it happened just before Christmas, and it took with it a piece of a beloved American holiday tradition. Her name was the Rouse Simmons, and by 1912, she had spent more than 2 decades doing one of the most cheerful jobs on the entire lake system, hauling Christmas trees. Every autumn, schooners like the Rouse Simmons would sail up into the dense forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, load their decks and holds with thousands of freshly cut evergreens, and haul them south across Lake Michigan to Chicago, where German immigrant families had helped popularize the American tradition of a decorated Christmas tree. The ship's captain, a warm, well-liked man named Herman Schooneman, had become something of a local celebrity for it. Dock workers and children alike called him Captain Santa. But by 1912, the Rouse Simmons was old, and she was showing it. She'd already broken down that season, and several of the other Christmas tree schooners had chosen to sit that year's run out entirely because the weather had been unusually violent. Schooneman sailed anyway. He loaded the ship with more than 5,000 trees, so many that the deck cargo had to be propped up on wooden crutches just to keep it manageable, and some accounts claim a sailor jumped ship before departure after hearing a rumor that the rats aboard had fled, an old and deeply superstitious warning sign among sailors of the era. On November 21st, the Rouse Simmons set out from the Upper Peninsula on the 350-mile run to Chicago, sailing directly into what would become known as one of the worst storms in Great Lakes history, sustained gale-force winds, driving snow, and waves that turned the entire lake into a churning white chaos. 2 days later, on November 23rd, a life-saving station in Kewaunee, Wisconsin, spotted her limping along the coast, her sails in tatters, her deck weighed down with ice, and her flag flying at half-mast, the universal signal for a ship in mortal distress. The station's rescue tug had already left on another call. By the time a second station scrambled a boat to help her, the Rouse Simmons had vanished into the storm. She was never seen intact again. All 17 or 18 men aboard were lost. In Chicago, newspapers grimly dubbed 1912 the year without Christmas. For weeks, orphan trees washed ashore along the Wisconsin and Illinois coastline, a haunting, almost unbearably poignant image that cemented the tragedy in the public imagination. The wreck itself wasn't discovered until 1971, nearly 60 years later, resting 165 feet down, when a diver named Kent Bell-Richard finally located her remains. In the years between her sinking and her rediscovery, fishermen occasionally pulled up ghostly trace evidence of her fate, trees tangled in nets far from where anyone expected them, and in 1924, 12 years after she went down, Captain Schooneman's own wallet turned up intact inside a fisherman's net, the contents perfectly preserved by the oilskin wrapping and a rubber band. It was a discovery that reignited public grief for a man Chicago had never forgotten. And for decades after her sinking, sailors along that stretch of Lake Michigan reported spotting a schooner in the distance, sails torn, decks stacked impossibly high with trees, drifting through fog on a route she could never actually finish. The tradition surrounding her hasn't entirely faded, either. Since the year 2000, the United States Coast Guard has run its own modern Christmas tree ship along a similar route each December, delivering trees to Chicago in quiet tribute to Captain Santa and the crew who never made it home. The Griffon, the Bannockburn, and the Rouse Simmons are the 3 names most closely associated with the phrase, ghost ship of the Great Lakes. But they are far from the only vessels whose disappearance has taken on a supernatural afterlife. The steamer Western Reserve went down in a sudden squall on Lake Superior in 1892 after her hull, made of a newer and supposedly stronger steel alloy, snapped in half, a failure so unexpected that it shook public confidence in modern shipbuilding at the time. The Chicora vanished on Lake Michigan in 1895 while attempting to deliver flour during a brutal winter storm, and to this day her final resting place has never been confirmed. Then there's the story of the SS Kamloops, a Canadian steel freighter that vanished on Lake Superior in early December of 1927, swallowed by one of the season's worst storms while trying to make a late run before the shipping lanes froze over for winter. 22 men disappeared with her, and for exactly 50 years, nobody knew what had become of them. No wreckage. No bodies. No answers, just a name added to the long list of Lake Superior's missing. Then, in 1977, divers finally located her wreck resting in frigid water off Isle Royale, and what they found down there has unsettled Great Lakes divers ever since. Preserved almost perfectly by the near-freezing temperature of the water at that depth, one crew member's body was still recognizable inside the wreck, sealed in a state divers came to describe, half in dark humor and half in genuine unease, as an eternal watchman standing guard over his ship. Divers who have visited the site over the decades since have nicknamed him Old Whitey, and to this day, experienced technical divers who make the difficult, dangerous descent to the Kamloops describe an atmosphere down there unlike almost any other wreck on the lakes, not because of anything supernatural, necessarily, but because the ship still feels, in a way few shipwrecks do, genuinely inhabited. It's a stark, physical reminder of something the ghost ship stories tend to soften with legend and mist. These aren't just old tales. Real men went down with these vessels, and in Superior's cold, they sometimes stay remarkably close to exactly as they were the day the lake took them. And on Lake Michigan in particular, some writers and amateur researchers have gone further still, describing an entire stretch of water between Ludington, Michigan, Benton Harbor, and Manitowoc, Wisconsin, as a kind of freshwater Bermuda Triangle, a zone, they claim, associated with an unusually high number of disappearances, strange compass malfunctions, and unexplained aircraft losses, in addition to the ships. It's worth saying clearly, this idea has never been taken seriously by mainstream maritime historians or the Coast Guard, and most of the disappearances attributed to it have far more mundane explanations rooted in weather, navigational error, and the simple, brutal statistics of how many vessels have crossed these lakes over the centuries. But the persistence of the legend tells you something important about how deeply the idea of the vanishing ship has embedded itself in the culture of this region. And it isn't only ships from the age of sail and early steel that have joined this list of legends. Even in the modern era of radar, radio, and satellite tracking, the Great Lakes have proven they can still take a ship without giving a full explanation. On November 10, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, a modern 729-foot or carrier, one of the largest vessels ever to sail the Great Lakes, went down in a savage Lake Superior storm with all 29 crew members aboard, sinking so suddenly that she never got off a distress call. To this day, marine investigators still debate the exact mechanical cause of her loss, whether she was overwhelmed by rogue waves, whether she struck an unmarked shoal, or whether structural failure played the decisive role. Her story became known to millions of Americans through a mournful folk ballad that turned her sinking into one of the most famous songs about the Great Lakes ever recorded, ensuring that even people who have never set foot near Lake Superior know her name. In the years since, some sailors navigating near the site of her wreck have reported strange lights and radio interference in the area, though these accounts remain far more sparse and far more contested than the century-old lore surrounding ships like the Bannockburn. So what's actually going on here? Is there a rational explanation for any of this, or are we simply looking at a very old, very human habit of turning tragedy into legend? The honest answer is probably some of both. Meteorologists and physicists who study these lakes point to a genuine, well-documented atmospheric phenomenon called a superior mirage, sometimes known by its older name, Fata Morgana, a trick of temperature layering over cold water that can cause distant ships, sometimes ships that are hull down over the horizon or even entirely out of normal line of sight, to appear to float, stretch, or seemingly hover impossibly close. Under the right freezing conditions, this effect can make an ordinary freighter miles away look like it's gliding just offshore, wrapped in mist, exactly the kind of image that has fed ghost ship reports for generations. Combine that with fog, low light, exhaustion, and the deeply ingrained folklore sailors have passed down for 3 centuries about this exact stretch of water, and it's not hard to understand why so many experienced, credible witnesses have reported seeing vessels that, by any rational accounting, shouldn't be there. But science doesn't erase the mystery entirely, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Because at the center of every one of these legends sits an unresolved historical fact: real ships, with real crews, genuinely vanished under circumstances nobody has ever fully explained. Griffon has never been found, not conclusively, not after 345 years and dozens of false claims. The Bannockburn disappeared in front of a credible eyewitness, in open water, in the space of a few minutes, and her wreck has never been located. The exact final moments of the Rouse Simmons were witnessed by absolutely no one who survived to describe them. When the physical evidence of a tragedy is this thin, the human imagination doesn't stay quiet. It fills the silence. And on the Great Lakes, that silence has been filled, generation after generation, by the same haunting image: a ship that should have gone down, and somehow, according to the people who claim to have seen her, never quite did. Whether you believe a single one of these sightings or dismiss them all as mirages and grief-given a shape sailors could point to, one thing about these stories remains undeniable. The Great Lakes have never stopped taking ships, and they have never stopped keeping secrets. Somewhere beneath more than 94,000 square miles of cold, dark, fresh water, there are still wrecks nobody has found, names nobody has confirmed, and families, going back 3 centuries, who never got a final answer. Maybe that unfinished business is the real reason these stories persist, not because anyone genuinely believes a wooden bark from 1679 is still sailing Lake Michigan, but because as long as Griffon stays lost, as long as the Bannockburn stays undiscovered, the story isn't actually over. And stories that aren't over have a way of refusing to stay buried, no matter how many years, or how many fathoms of cold water, stand between us and the truth. If you were out on Lake Superior or Lake Michigan tonight, in the fog, and something appeared on the horizon that shouldn't be there, would you sail toward it to see what it was, or would you turn your boat around? Tell us honestly, in the comments, what you'd actually do.